The respected elven sorceress queen stood at the precipice of her glorious vision, the culmination of nearly a century of preparation. Each of her followers, the Shadar-kai, had pledged their mind and soul to fulfill her promise, believing the queen and her grand ritual would unite a fractured elven people and pave passage for all elves into the divine realm, the elven heaven known as Arvindor. The success of this bold ritual would also see the Elven Queen's own ascension to join the ranks of the Seldarine, gaining her long-sought-after divinity. She stood upon a raised dais of ancient stone surrounded by dozens of her most loyal Shadar-kai followers. Their intrinsic connection to the shadow was ever present, part of their essence that tied them to the bleak, otherworldly plane known as the Shadowfell. The liturgical rite she had devised was meant to tap into the power of that innate link, drawing upon the energies of the Shadowfell as a conduit to unite and elevate her people beyond the petty conflicts that had plagued their kind for millennia. The ceremony began beneath the starry skies of an ancient elven forest. A ring of luminous runes shimmered around the queen, symbols that pulse with life and death, reaching out toward the veil between worlds. The Shadar-kai formed a silent circle around the queen, their hearts beating in tune with the rhythm of the ritual, eyes cast down in deep reverence. Yet not all within this gathering were as loyal as they seemed. Among the queen's followers stood 13 of the most powerful Shadar-kai wizards, their robes dark as the night, their eyes gleaming with hidden ambition. They had once sworn fealty to her, but now their minds burned with a jealous lust and greed for the same power the Elven Queen now sought. This secret cabal sought not the unity and peace promised by the Queen's ascension, but rather to divert the unharnessed power that the ritual would unleash. In their arrogance, they believed they could steal the power of shadows, rip from the Queen's grasp to wield it for themselves. The Queen's voice rose in song, a haunting melody that stirred the forces of the Shadowfell to blend with the powerful magic of the Sorceress Queen and the very souls of her Shadar-kai people. She could feel the presence of the Shadowfell on the edge of the ritual, its dark energy flowing through her and her followers, binding each to the dark art that would transform her into a divine being. But as is so often the case when an account of a grand ritual makes its way into the tomes of historical record, it was not to be as planned. The 13 Shadar-kai wizards had covertly began their treasonous acts. Under their breath, the elven wizards whispered practiced counterspell incantations, their fingers tracing forbidden symbols in the air, yet unnoticed by the Sorceress Queen. Their spellwork was subtle, even elegant, veiled beneath the undulating waves of shadow now surging through the ritual. And for a moment it seemed as though they might just succeed. The Sorceress Queen, absorbed in her own task, did not immediately notice the disturbance, the betrayal, but notice she would. Dark energy coiled from the ground, the alien force from the plane of shadow building to a crescendo just as the Sorceress Queen was on the cusp of her own divinity. But this delicate arcane ceremony was not meant to be interrupted, and the wizard's interference altered the highly precise nature of the ritual. The Sorceress Queen discovered the betrayal, but only at the last moment. At the apex of her incantation, control was lost as its magic spun awry in shockwaves that rippled through the arcane weave, unraveling the fragile balance the Queen had so carefully crafted. The ground beneath them groaned, the air reverberated with seen and unseen forces, and the sky itself darkened as the volatile link to the Shadowfell became warped and unstable. The Queen's song faltered, her eyes widening as she realized the betrayal and the cost the Shadowfell would soon enact for such failure. The deceitful wizards felt it too, their grasp on the embezzled, now intractable magic slipping through their fingers as uncontrollable as sand. Panic set in as the ritual spiraled wildly out of control. The Shadowfell energies became twisted and profane, its dark essence reaching out across the veil with a terrible hunger to claim those souls who had foolishly bound to its powers. In a violent surge, the boundary between the material and shadow plane was shattered. The ground split, and from the fissure's depths, tendrils of violet and black poured forth, wrapping themselves around the queen, her loyal Shadow-Kai, and the treacherous wizards alike. The queen let out a scream as the shadow's grasp tightened around her first, pulling the sorceress deep into the penumbra. As the corrupted ritual that had once promised to ascend her to divinity now sought to consume the sorceress, the call of the Shadowfell stretched across all the material plane, now demanding its cost be paid. The price? Everything. Each and every one of her loyal Shadow-Kai followers, their souls now bound to the plane, would also be dragged into the realm of forever shadows. The 13 wizards attempted to resist, but it was futile. The power they had sought to harness now leached onto their mind, body, and soul, and one by one they too were pulled into the endless dark, their torment echoing into the null as the Shadowfell claimed them all. But our story is not yet complete. As the mortal body of the Sorceress Queen began to dissolve, slowly suffusing with the shadows, she used the last remnants of her near-divine power to cloak her spirit, her essence, within the countless fragmented memories drifting across the plane. In timelines hardly comprehended by mortals, the Queen was reborn. Her mortal body vanquished, she was no longer an elven sorceress. Under the cover of negative energies, lost memories, and a touch of madness, she rose from the ashes of her own oblivion to become the Raven Queen. She stood in the midst of the Shadowfell, her own memories crystal clear as her gaze fell upon the remaining vestiges of the 13 wizards who had betrayed her. They lay at her feet, their twisted elven bodies writhing in the misery of darkness. These selfish wizards had corrupted any chance of elven unity and defaced her own claim of divinity. Now their fates would eternally atone for such treachery. With a gesture of her hand, the now godlike entity of the Raven Queen cast her final judgment, letting loose a scream of ebon smoke that penetrated the essence of the wizards, turning their bones black and lacerating their souls. Their cries of agony merged with her own, and when her scream faded, the elven wizards had been mutated into their hideous, cursed forms. Their flesh became scabrous and mottled, their bones twisted into hunched-over avian forms, and their faces warped into a blasphemous fusion of vulture and blighted humanoid. Realizing the outcome of their duplicitous actions, their wings of feathered decay flapped uselessly against the dark winds of the Shadowfell. The Raven Queen mused. These betrayers sought knowledge and selfish empowerment through her ruin. Now they would be cursed evermore, that same destiny.
You shall be the Nagpa,
the Raven Queen spoke, her voice a powerful whisper carried on the sharp, cold winds of the Shadowfell.
Cursed to crave knowledge unsated to the point of madness, yet doomed to seek it only in the wake of the fallen. You will plot and scheme, but your greatest ambitions, your corrupted hubris, will bring nothing but ruin. And with each passing moment of incessant torment, you will remember the moment you betrayed me.
These 13 Nagpa would scatter to the far corners of the world, banished from the presence of the Raven Queen, condemned to wander the plains, their curse eternal, their hunger insatiable. Through the Raven Queen's curse, the Nagpa would carve a path toward ruin. In the wake of destruction, calamity, and loss, they are drawn, powerless to resist its call. Amid every crumbling ruin, from the war-torn remnants of razed kingdoms to the desolate wastelands of cataclysmic events, they are likely present, if often unseen. Their dark eyes gleaming with obsession, seeking knowledge, power, and perhaps a way to escape the shadow of the Raven Queen. Yet every discovery would bring them only despair and longing, the ever-present reminder of the disloyal acts that had doomed them and an entire people. Escape would never come, for in the end, their greatest ruin was themselves. Welcome to the Monster Lab, dedicated to the in-depth study and analysis of Dungeons & Dragons creature lore. Within these narrative walls, lore scholars, adventurers, dungeon masters, and the curious will uncover the unseen secrets and obscure histories of the fantastical beings that fill the pages of countless tomes and evolve through the various editions of our lore. The focus of this volume of study is the Nagpa, a being that, despite making its Dungeons & Dragons debut over 40 years ago, has remained relatively obscure for much of its history. However, today we're going to do our part to help change that, giving this esoteric creature a proper lore profile and breakdown. Thanks in part to some fortunate timing as we just wrapped up our 4-part Shadow series, the Nagpa in their 5th edition lore now holds some connective tissue with the Raven Queen that featured heavily in that series, and so they occupy a position as a mostly unknown yet still intriguing subject worthy of our discovery. The Nagpa's journey into our worlds had the most humble of origins, making its first appearance in the basic D&D adventure module, Master of the Desert Nomads, published in a now almost prehistoric time when the A-Team and Knight Rider were among the top shows on TVs that mostly offered a whopping 3 channels, all the way back in 1983. In its earliest of iterations, the Nagpa was little more than a vulture-like monster, a simple creature with humanoid-like traits but few distinguishing characteristics beyond its unsettling appearance. At this stage, it was far from the nuanced role it would later hold in the lore. As the game itself matured, so did the lore surrounding the Nagpa, transforming across each iteration of the historical text and growing from little more than an ancillary threat into a creature whose existence is now intimately tied to the themes of knowledge, corruption, and even divine punishment. Later presented as an intelligent but cruel, paranoid, and even otherworldly creature, the always reclusive Nagpa maintain a persistent theme as a collector of arcane secrets and forbidden knowledge. Its appalling form, a withered fusion of vulture and elderly arcane wizard, became not just a marker of its physical state, but also the inescapable reflection of its own hubris, ambition, and corruption. A repulsive being whose obsession with gathering knowledge at any cost would persist throughout its evolution and even hint at its own downfall. As the Nagpa moved through the various editions of the game, their presence would come to stand as a warning, a symbol of what happens when the lustful thirst for power outweighs loyalty, morality, and even the greater good, becoming a creature of tragedy whose existence will raise questions about the cost of knowledge and the price one must pay for forbidden truths. Our expedition into the lore of the Nagpa has only just begun. As we move through this monster lab, we will explore how its role and origins began to take shape in these early editions of the game and then evolved over time. And when we are done, we will come to understand their full depth of lore, the tragic decisions that shaped their fate, and what makes these cursed beings a unique and compelling, if obscure, facet of the 5th edition texts. If you enjoy and/or find any value in these long-form essays, perhaps consider showing your support over on my Patreon, where I have an ever-growing collection of resources to populate and enhance your adventures and worlds. You can check it all out and join for free with zero obligation. You don't have to spend a dime unless you want to. And at the very least, it's just a great way for me to interact with each of you. Links are below, and a sincere thank you to my supporters that make this video possible. As we begin our discoveries of these earliest Nagpa, you would be forgiven for dismissing them as creatures that, at first glance, may seem trite or trivial when compared to the grandiose dragons, fiendish archdevils and demon lords, or the cryptic and powerful liches that typically haunt the pages of the more popular bestiaries. Yet, to dismiss the Nagpa as insignificant would be a short-sighted mistake, and not at all in the spirit of uncovering the obscure. For hidden within its monstrous form lies a creature that has continually evolved a compelling backstory that I think many will find presents itself as a unique component that can effectively be leveraged by creative dungeon masters to create unique narratives and some layered encounter building. One unavoidable aspect of the Nagpa design we must at least mention is the clear debt that D&D's original publisher TSR owed to the 1982 film The Dark Crystal, specifically the movie's infamous antagonist, the Skeksis. Released just a year before the Nagpa's own 1983 debut, the visual and thematic parallels between the two are simply unmistakable. Both the Nagpa and the Skeksis are hideous, vulture-like beings, their gnarled forms symbolizing their foul nature and corrupting influence. Like the Skeksis, these Nagpa of the second edition were defined by similar traits: a decaying physicality, supreme intelligence, extreme arrogance, a penchant for manipulation, and a disposition that embodies an era of aristocratic decadence. I would add a side note here that this all took place during the TSR years, a time when it is more than safe to say the company took a very loose, maybe nebulous stance on copyright infringement, as this would not be the first or last time TSR would borrow heavily from other known works. Nonetheless, following their 1983 introduction, the Nagpa, while possessing a certainly unique look, were still modest, vulture-like humanoid creatures that were designed more for simple monster encounters than any figure of deep lore. They remain, as far as interesting lore goes, pretty basic at this stage. However, that would finally begin to change a full 6 years after their introduction. To say the Nagpa were late bloomers in terms of lore evolution would be an understatement. While uncommon but not unheard of, the Nagpa were first introduced in that 1983 adventure module as opposed to an official bestiary or monster manual. This would at least be one of the reasons they would enter our worlds with very little actual lore and backstory. The Nagpa lore would find some depth when updated 6 years later in the 1989 publication Top Ballista as part of the Creature Crucible series, which colors the Nagpa as alien beings who did not naturally belong to or originate upon the worlds they now inhabit. In this first update, we learn that the Nagpa arrived from another world, possibly through a wormhole or a gate, though no definitive details about their travels are known, even by the Nagpa themselves. You see, the lore suggests their journey across the cosmos had left them amnesiac, their own histories fractured by some implied trauma they endured during their migration across the cosmos. Because of this, the Nagpa retain only fragmented memories, glimpsed in half-conscious daydreams and fleeting visions. These daydreams introduce us to one of the more unique traits of the early Nagpa, their practice of karawa, a crucial aspect of their daily lives. Roughly translated to daydreaming, karawa is a form of meditation that allows the Nagpa to glimpse fragments of their lost past. However, this daily practice was not just an indulgence, but it was in fact a necessity. Without engaging in karawa for at least 30 minutes each day, the Nagpa risks falling into a deep slumber from which they could not be easily awoken for up to 4 hours. Worse still, prolonged deprivation of karawa leads to more severe consequences, including various phobias, paranoia, and even madness. The Nagpa's mind, already teetering on the edge of sanity due to the trauma of their origins and their intelligence, were a fragile balance and prone to complete collapse without this daily ritual. The lore of these scattered memories, however, would also fuel their obsession with acquiring knowledge, a trait that would come to characterize the Nagpa in some form across all of its future iterations. The Nagpa believe all knowledge is sacred, that every scrap of information, no matter how obscure or arcane, holds value. Both highly intelligent and supremely arrogant, the Nagpa believe they are uniquely positioned to understand the mysteries of the cosmos, driven by their near-divine sense of intellectual superiority. This early personality trait of the Nagpa see themselves as semi-divine scholars who often engage in grand architectural projects such as the construction of knowledge archives, observatories, and libraries. Strong of mind but physically weak, the cruelty of the Nagpa is probably best illustrated with their reliance on others to carry out their designs, often employing everything from deceitful manipulation, blackmail, and even enslavement and forced servitude to complete their visions. Even at this early stage, the Nagpa would also begin to find a deep connection to death and the practice of undeath, utilizing the powers of necromancy to animate various skeleton and zombie types to serve as their mindless workers and protectors. Although it should be noted here that Nagpa are always careful to keep these dark arts a secret, denying their practice of necromancy to any and all that might question. As creatures that seek solitude whenever possible, Nagpa despise other living beings, preferring the cold comfort of crypts, mausoleums, and other tomb-like environments. Within their subterranean lairs, they will often hoard their knowledge archives with the same passion and greed as a red dragon counting its gold coins. The Nagpa lairs are designed and constructed under their careful supervision and are meticulously maintained, especially with regard to keeping their vast collections of prized books, scrolls, and tomes dry and free from knowledge-destroying moisture. The Nagpa with this first update were growing in intrigue, yet still incomplete from its final form. Their cosmic alien origins, while mysterious, left them disconnected from the worlds they occupy. And while the lore did establish them as cynical, cruel, even evil creatures of knowledge and necromancy, capable of sinister feats of intellect and the arcane, there still remained a lack of depth in their role. The next iteration of the Nagpa would bring some much-needed refinement to their character, anchoring them more firmly to the native mythologies of the worlds they inhabit, and introduce a new origin seed that provides a far more personal and ultimately tragic backstory that will thankfully remain, at least partially, consistent across editions. The transition of the Nagpa lore from its earlier forms based in the Greyhawk universe to a more refined presentation as the decade turned would begin with a significant shift in the creature's origin narrative. Starting with an article entitled The Voyage of the Princess Ark, written by Bruce A. Hurd and found in 1990's Dragon Magazine number 157, the Nagpa would shed much of its original alien origins, instead now embracing a more sinister but terrestrial identity and one more firmly rooted in the themes of death, necromancy, and unfortunately for the Nagpa, a series of curses that were divine in nature. In that Dragon article, with lore written as an adventure chronicle or a series of journal entries, the Nagpa find themselves portrayed as cursed beings originating from the ancient kingdom of Varelia, situated in a harsh and desolate region known as the Vulture Peninsula. This region of unforgiving desert and rocky wasteland was so named for a prominent sandstone plateau resembling a vulture's head that rises over 600 feet into the air. But Varelia was not always a desert, once a thriving civilization blessed with fertile plains and numerous rivers and lakes. However, a brutal civil war between two princely brothers, the calling of immortal powers, and lots of dark magic spiraling out of control would lay waste to Varelia, and in the process also cursed its inhabitants, mutating them into the Nagpa. Now damned into an immortally cursed existence, upon death the Nagpa reincarnate after 5 to 8 months, emerging once again as the adult desert-dwelling carrion feeders with full memories of their past lives. They relive their atrocities perpetually and are compelled to perform annual rituals that seek atonement that they will never be granted, forever bound by this same curse. One nice touch found in this article is a callback to the original 1983 adventure module introduction, where players encounter that first Nagpa named Abatu. That name would become central to this updated lore as we learn that Abatu is one of the aforementioned feuding princes of Varelia. Originally a crown prince, Abatu played a pivotal role in the kingdom's downfall through his treacherous actions and necromantic experiments, and ultimately is responsible for the curse that afflicted the Nagpa. 4 years later, with the release of 1994's monstrous compendium for the Mystara setting, the Nagpa origin lore would only be mildly retconned, now taking the form of former mortal wizards, cursed for their hubris and selfishness by the gods or other powerful entities. This curse condemned the Nagpa to wander the realms, unable to experience the basic pleasures of life, such as eating, sleeping, or even the ability to laugh or experience joy. This new version of the Nagpa was firmly embedded in the world of Mystara, and the lore no longer references the practice of Karawa, which was a key element of their earlier lore that tied them to their alien origins. This new variant of the Nagpa also introduced a more complex psychological aspect to their character. Filled with the shame of their curse, they are highly paranoid of others learning about their afflicted past, information they will hide and protect at any cost. And should a mortal discover their secret, the Nagpa will react with extreme hostility, often seeking out and eliminating anyone who knows too much. To that end, the curse also grants them a strong ability in support of that lore. Each Nagpa is instinctively aware when others are speaking about them anywhere within a 100-mile radius. In a play on the ancient Roman idiom, this innate sense would cause their ears to burn, and like some organic motion tracker, the burning sensation would become hotter the closer they came to finding the gossipers. The power of their affliction is such that the Nagpa are then both compelled to track down the offender and eliminate them with prejudice. And to further illustrate the torment of this curse, once the culprits are slain, the Nagpa are then consumed with almost debilitating guilt and remorse. This paranoia further played into the isolated nature of the Nagpa, making them deeply distrustful of others and reinforcing their solitary existence. This iteration of the Nagpa solidified them as tragic figures, cursed to wander, eternally pursuing knowledge, but forever deny the pleasures of life that others such as you and I likely take for granted. As the Nagpa moved into the 4th edition of our lore, their origins would once again shift, maintaining their cursed existence, but now supporting the 4E cataclysmic event known as the Dawn War. The first thing we should note as we move into the lore of the 4th edition text is understanding that the Nagpa have no 4E connection to the Raven Queen, the goddess of death who played such a central and starring role for this edition's points of light setting. But even as the Nagpa will be met with another retcon, I would also point out here that as retcons go, the Nagpa have been handled pretty well thus far. While the goal should be to not retcon whenever possible, we know that this is inevitable, and with the Nagpa, much of the conflicting lore, for example the changing origins of their curse, can easily be explained as it centers not on if the Nagpa were cursed, but instead on how and by who were they cursed, which is far more plausible and easy to work with. And that is again the case with these variant Nagpa, now placed in the Dawn War setting of 4th edition. In this version of the lore, the Nagpa were created by the ancient primordials in the midst of their battle with the gods over control of the nascent world of Toril. Said to be created with both the beauty of the nymphs and the cunning of devils, these Nagpa were ideal primordial agents of deception and seduction. Initially, they served their masters well, wreaking havoc on the gods and their followers through both ambush and trickery. Their intellect and magical prowess made them invaluable assets in the conflict, and for a time the Nagpa thrived in this role. However, as the Dawn War drew to a close, the Nagpa saw the inevitable defeat of their primordial masters, and so they chose to betray them, striking a pact with the gods to ensure their own survival. This act of treachery, a consistent and running theme of the Nagpa lore thus far, and one as a lore scholar that I appreciate, did not go unnoticed. As punishment, they are once again cursed, the primordials transforming them into the hideous vulture-like creatures that have come to define the Nagpa. The beauty and grace they once possessed were stripped away, leaving them with an insatiable appetite for wealth and bodily comforts that they could never truly enjoy. While they still craved knowledge as well, their desire for wealth and treasure grew, driving them to amass vast hoards of gold, gems, and magical items that could never satisfy their endless hunger. As the Nagpa enter the era of current 5e lore, their connection to the Raven Queen would finally be established, bringing with it a new dimension to their character and, in my opinion, their most dynamic role in the cosmology. The Nagpa would be added to the 5th edition lore in the pages of 2018's Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, where they would find their most prominent role. Following the lore of our opening story introduction, and in support of a new origin story for a dark goddess who would herself be transformed in her migration to the Forgotten Realms lore of the 5e texts, the Nagpa are reimagined as a group of 13 powerful wizards once favored by the elven sorceress who would become the Raven Queen. Originally of Shadar-kai heritage, these wizards had served their queen loyally, but their ambition and lust for power led them to meddle in a ritual that would have united the elven people. This act of interference had, of course, catastrophic consequences, and in the aftermath, the Raven Queen's wrath was swift and merciless. Dragged into the Shadowfell along with their queen and all the Shadar-kai people, the wizards faced her divine fury as she rose from the ashes of that failed ritual. Her dark scream of retribution and sorrow, infused with the negative energies of the Shadowfell, would mutate their elven bodies into the now familiar but no less unsettling, decayed vulture-like forms. However, the Raven Queen's curse did more than transform their bodies. It forever shackled their ambitions, and as such provided us with their most current, and in my opinion, most dynamic role. The Nagpa were no longer free or even able to acquire knowledge as they once had. Instead, they were bound by the Raven Queen's magic, forced to seek out lore only from the ruins of fallen civilizations. This restriction not only shaped their existence in many profound ways, but for dungeon masters and world builders, this serves as a great plot device, as the Nagpa are now driven to orchestrate calamities and disasters, and they do so all in the hope of plundering the wreckage and ruins, searching for the secrets they so desperately crave. Although these 5e challenge rating 17 Nagpa are easily the most powerful variants, appropriate given their finite number, they live in constant dread of the Raven Queen's gaze, knowing that her wrath could find them at any moment. Yet even in their cursed state, these evil-aligned knowledge seekers continue to plot and manipulate, ever watchful for the next opportunity to bring about the downfall of a kingdom or empire. Careless of the cost or cruelty, all in the distant hope they might uncover the knowledge and power that would free them from the Raven Queen's curse. Another consistent theme for the Nagpa, maintained in the 5th edition and now more important than ever, is their immortality. These 13 Nagpa persist, reincarnating after each death with all the memories of their previous lives intact. It is an endless cycle that only serves to amplify their bitterness and despair, fueling their relentless pursuit of knowledge and power through their own callous chaos and ruinous destruction. Today's Monster Lab analysis of the Nagpa's origins and lore across editions really highlights what I have to conclude is a solid approach of consistency and improvement when retconning is required or otherwise unavoidable. While retcons should be avoided where possible, there are exceptions when a change is required to fit a new edition and/or setting, and where the lore can be positioned as a plausible change based upon evolving knowledge, new mortal discoveries, or even the changing of a religious doctrine. You might recall from the dedicated volumes of the Shadar-kai and especially the Sorrowsworn just how dramatic and jarring lore retcons can actually be. In the case of the 5e Sorrowsworn, creating what are for all intents and purposes a new creature with virtually no remnant connection to their past iterations. However, I am happy to report that in the case of the Nagpa, we find a creature that has certainly seen much change, but has also consistently adapted to the changing dynamics of most every edition of lore and setting, and does so in a way that can be seen as more organic and without any major foundational fractures to existing lore. Even the most dramatic change to their number, limited to only 13, not only avoids laying waste too much of the previous lore, but actually creates new depth and narrative layers that should make for some excellent potential world building for your table. And that, in my opinion, should be applauded. And that completes our Monster Lab dissection on the Nagpa. If you have a monster you'd like to see us capture and throw on the examination table, be sure to let me know with a comment down below. A special thank you to my YouTube channel members and my supporters over on Patreon, who through their generous support make this video possible. If you'd like to support my work, it's a win-win by joining my Patreon, where I have an ever-growing collection of DM and world-building resources, adventure packs, 4K art packs, homebrew creations, plus so much more. So check it out over on my Patreon. Join for free with no obligation. At the very least, it's just a great way for me to interact with each of you. Links are below. And finally, if you think I earned it, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening, and until next time, remember, the only limitation at your table is your imagination.